wonderful occasion in Roundwood House in this new and magnificent library. Now, but the last thing I want to say is this. Frank is going to talk about civilization. And I can't think of a better person. I really can't. Because he is the most civilized man.
Voltaire wrote over 200 years ago that he wanted to know the steps by which we came from civilization, from barbarity to civilization. An impossible ideal in his time, but not so impossible now. The library is about trying to trace those steps, trying to figure out what those steps were that brought us all that way. And to do it in a manageable or graspable size, 1,000 volumes. That's what you see on the ground floor here. Upstairs are simply related books. The idea is not so much individual books, although there's some of those you cannot avoid, but disciplines, a search for disciplines, a search for what we did as humans. So if I take one discipline, say the art of novel writing, the library is not about, some of the entries for novels are there because they were the first of their kind and therefore changed everything. Some are there for their polemical effect, both good and bad, because they did have a huge effect. The rest are there as examples of the best of the métier. They're not there as more than examples. There's no suggestion that they are the best novels in the world. They're just examples of the best. The project is very embryonic, so we're still waiting for an awful lot of help on what we should do. I need to get rid of one niggle that has beset us since the beginning of all this, and the niggle is that disciplines are unequal. A suggestion that science is better than humanities and this is better than that and whatnot. The most honest expression of it I know is in a book by a guy called Michael Hart 20 or 30 years ago called The 100. He apologizes in it for his positioning of Shakespeare because he had the nerve to put him in position as well as everything else. He said I need to quote him properly. He said, although he loves the beauty and entertainment of Shakespeare's works, he ranked it where he did because of his belief in general. Literary and artistic figures have had comparatively little influence on human history. This kind of sentiment is all too common. Although nowadays science, of course, has to share the fancy notion of itself with business. Nobody noticed that. Beauty and entertainment were not all that Shakespeare gave us. Those were his hooks. They were what kept our attention. What he really did, whether intentionally or not, was enrich our language enormously, and thereby our communication, and enrich our understanding of each other's consciousness, of strangers' consciousness. And that allowed us to develop empathy. And without empathy, you cannot have civilization. Empathy, if you like, if I take modern weaponry and a medieval mindset would be a catastrophe. They are, in a small way, a catastrophe already, but they would be an utter catastrophe. Even my own beloved Steven Pinker can manage to paint himself as a Philistine when he's writing about art. I think, like a lot of people, I think forgetting that the first sign in the world that something truly extraordinary was happening, something had changed utterly, was in the cave paintings of Altamira and elsewhere. I think you daren't forget that, but disciplines shouldn't fight like that. Look, it would probably match your expectations if I said I started this whole project started because of a love of books and a love of history. It didn't. It started because of anger, rage almost, that we use this word civilization as if it didn't mean anything. It's a catch-all word. We use it to describe anything and everything. That's nonsense. It's perhaps the single most important endeavour that humanity gets involved in. But recently an American politician, you can imagine which party, and I think talking about the gay marriage fracas, he said, "We are destroying civilization, or what's left of it." So he obviously knew what civilization was, but nobody asked him, so he never got to elucidate for us. And they didn't ask him because they didn't know. It's any old politician can use it any old way he wants. Before telling you what I think it is, I want to talk for a little while about genetics, layperson's genetics. Because genetics, as lay people, genetics lead us all sorts of places. We're fooled by them, we're conned by them, not by geneticists, by ourselves. So I'd say first of all that the idea of families, their generations are a geometric progression. You've got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8, 16. It takes very little time to get to astronomical numbers. So if you go back to the last millennium, and you know somebody who has an ancestor dating from that time, well, let me tell you, if they have descendants at all, you're all descendants, direct descendants. And you are thousands of times over, because we don't get our genetics from a fine line of wonderful people. We get it through a gene pool, nowhere else. So when you think about your genes, they're nothing special. They're part of that gene pool. They're for millennia. The way to get a fancy family tree is, the only way to do it is primogeniture, which means you take your family tree, but you first of all remove every single woman involved, including the mothers, as if they had nothing to do with the genes, but all the sisters and everyone else, the daughters, and then you remove all the sons who weren't the firstborn. A mad way to decide to act in the modern world. So you've got as I say, we don't come from long lines of fancy lineage. The ridiculous notion of a natural aristocracy or blue blood or any such notions are complete nonsense. They're utter complete nonsense. It just, if we've given these people undue influence and respect and all sorts of nonsense for millennia, not because of anything real, but because they used primogeniture to pretend they were illustrious families. And if you try and skim the edges of a gene pool, as royalty and the aristocracy were trying to do, you end up with skinny genes, and we all know how bad they are for your health. When it was thought that Napoleon was safely locked up in Elba, the Ancien regime were back in Paris. The poor bishop of Paris, in speaking to his lineage-rich congregation in Notre Dame, managed to say that not only was Jesus Christ the Son of God, but equally he came from an excellent family. They equally might explain part of the French Revolution, at least. All of that is all of that doesn't even, the family tree thing, the genetic thing, I haven't even included the fact that, have you any idea of the mayhem caused to a family tree with just one illicit relationship. As you all know, we don't have those in Ireland. There's no hanky-panky here. But the neighbouring island, oh heavens. There is a much less innocent approach to fooling us about genetics. Last year, a man called Stephen Wade wrote a best-selling book called The Troublesome Inheritance. In it, he wrote that, he started off by saying that no, genetics give no basis for racism, no validation to racism. He then went on to hypothesize that maybe the Industrial Revolution started in England because of the cautious and patient genes of the English middle class. And then he said that Jewish people are more intelligent than the rest of us, probably because the people who didn't like Talmudic studies left the race, and that improved the genetic component of the remainder. And he actually said that Iraq and Afghanistan were genetically incapable of forming a democratic society. Now that sort of stuff is commonplace in routine books, popular science books. But Wade was the ex-editor of the ex-science editor of the New York Times. And he used the work of some of the most eminent geneticists in the world as backup for his evidence. Now, what has ended up, and then it was synopsized in Time magazine. Now, what you get at the end of that is, quite an awful lot of really disgruntled, eminent geneticists, and endless people who will go to their graves thinking that that's something like science really says. And it's not, it's utter twaddle, but we accept it all the time. Since the double helix, genetics has taken center stage in science, and what it has done for us in terms of describing our past is astounding and astonishing. Neither word is overstated. It is amazing. But genetics are about our past. They have almost nothing to do with our future. We've been playing with the human things since the very dawn of agriculture. And nowadays we call that playing genetic engineering. Even our hopes for the miracles that will come of gene therapy are about fixing mistakes from the past. In genetic terms, mistakes is the wrong word. They were the mutations and whatnot that happened on our way to here. But they are mistakes, but we're not willing as humans to accept the brutality of survival of the fittest. And we shouldn't. We do sometimes, but we shouldn't, ever. When psychologists explain genetics to us and explain kinship and say, well, you protect your family first, your siblings first, because they're the same genes as you, and your cousins then, and then the tribe. They're actually describing something we're trying to get rid of with civilization. Nepotism, tribalism, favoritism, familyism, anything you want to call it, racism even, is what they're suggesting the genetics do for us. And they don't do it for humans. I want you to remember that. They don't do it for humans. We do not, funnily enough, we accept this genetic thing all the time, but we don't even accept the genetic imperative to pass on your genes. Countless people, for multitudinous reasons, decide not to pass them on at all. Millions of others pass on far fewer genes than they could pass on. Now, being human and being intelligent, we don't all vote or select the pain of celibacy. We split the imperative and we keep the fun bit. what I'm really saying, and this is the centre of what I want to say, is that human societies, societal civilization, is actually evolution. But it's evolution, it's a continuation of genetic evolution, but it's evolution driven by intelligence, not by genetics. Genetics have nothing to do with our future. It's a new type of evolution that was and is essential. That we can't live without it. When human cognition first arrived, we were like comic book characters, super predator. We were wandering around almost animal in nature because genetics had brought us right up to that stage. But we had this enormous brain and no data to work with. So we were positively dangerous, not just to ourselves, but to life itself. Civilization is the evolutionary edifice we're building, and it's based on data and then knowledge and on a better understanding all the time of each other, of each other's consciousness, and a growth of tolerance. Cognition trumps genetics so comprehensively as to make genetics utterly meaningless in our futures. Initially, that idea of it being a continuation of evolution was a fairly lonely one. When Nigel Coppage recognized or saw some of my early work, he sent me back to read Richard Dawkins properly. Now, you all know who Richard Dawkins was, or is, the chap who spends most of his time trying to disprove the unprovable. A fairly silly idea at best. But Dawkins wrote, and I want to quote it, a passage from his book. You know, because when I had this idea, I mean, what does a geriatric layman from Laois do with such an idea? Build a library, as one does, and talk. But he writes in his Selfish Gene, we do not have to go to distant worlds to find other kinds of replicator and other consequent kinds of evolution. I think that a new type of replicator has recently emerged on this planet. It is staring us in the face. It is still in its infancy, still drifting clumsily about in its primeval soup. But already it is achieving evolutionary change at a rate that leaves the old gene panting far behind. The new soup is the soup of human culture. He had it, damn it. But he used the word replicator. And he then went on to talk about memes as the replicator. So what he was doing, what you've got is a very, very clever scientist, a very clever geneticist, who decides that you can apply genetics or a genetic type system to intelligence. And to study genetics and try to work out intelligence through it is very like studying a nightlight and trying to work out a blast furnace. It's I don't know why such a clever man would skip what he'd seen, what he'd already seen, and try to pass it on to genetics again. The reason you're hearing this kind of thing from a layman, and really, you know, it makes no sense at all that you're listening to me as a layman talking about such ideas. But in fact, the evidence is not in science laboratories. It's not anywhere in one piece. It's in our society, in the story of our past, our history, with all its branches, and you need to add all those branches together to get anywhere towards understanding civilization, that it is just the advance of humanity. In spite of the almost daily obituaries for civilizations, both past and present now, civilizations is a non-word. It's civilization. There are no civilizations. There's one human global civilization. When when the power structures that surround these civilizations, what they call civilizations, die, the civilization there are caused because they had the wealth to allow people to think. The civilization part of it didn't die, it passed on. So we still have the Romans took the learnings of the Greeks and applied it to what they could learn. But we still have all that. We still have the wisdom of ancient China, of the beauties of Sanskrit. Even in the self-induced mayhem, maelstrom that Germany got involved in the last century, we didn't lose Schiller or Goethe or Kant or Planck. When the British Empire folded in upon itself, we didn't lose Darwin or Newton or the beauty of the language of the Book of Common Prayer. It simply passed. It carries on irrespective of the meaningless life and death of empires. Leaving teleology to its own individual, separate arena, the immediate purpose we seem to have is to marry two very difficult things. One is independent free will, which humans have, and the good of the society. And that society, to me, is a global society. The most recent affirmation of that can be seen in our embrace of human rights, animal rights, the global reduction of violence. However counterintuitive that might seem, it's nonetheless true. Even in our willingness to belong to bigger and bigger political communities. Now, I don't want to go too far with that, because you all know that when we do get, and we will get, a world government, that Britain will opt to remain an associate member. Whether I'm right about how it all works doesn't matter. What does matter is to understand that civilization is a process and an accelerating one. If you could have lived to the age of Methuselah in ancient Egypt, you could have lived your life without being bothered by change much at all. But even the change in my parents' time was a meandering stream compared to the deluge of change that we're subject to now. The causes of this accelerating change are many, but they obviously include an increase in global literacy and communication. Computers, particularly because of their ability to store data and disseminate it easily. It's easily accessible. The gargantuan amounts of data compared to the past. To scholars and academics beavering away all over the world to add to our increase in our knowledge in the data we have, plus the knowledge we develop from that data. On top of all that, we have, of course, as you all know, a new society. The sort of put upon middle-class, white, heterosexual males had to do all the work about civilization in the past. Now people of other races and creeds and even women are getting so you now know that I believe that civilization is a process, a continuation of evolution, but driven by intelligence, not genetics, that it is an essential process and an accelerating one. That it began right at the arrival of human cognition and has continued ever since. That genetics are part of our animal past and not our future. That it is global and universal. It concerns us all equally, all humans. We have a great love of our own pixelated little bits of knowledge. And they're very important because we need to specialize. But there should be some of us, just a few, who stand back and look at the entire. The library is an attempt to encourage those few. Thank you for your patience.